Hello and welcome. Today we're going to be talking about the invention of race. This is often a shocking chapter because most people think of race as something that's permanent. You've been told your entire life that you belong to a racial group and that probably your biology is influenced by your race. And in this class and in this book, we discover that that is not true. Again, no geneticist can look at your genes and your DNA and tell you what race you are because that's just not how things work. Race is a social construction. We're the ones who made up the categories and said you belong to that category. Historically, there was no such thing as black or white. Black and white was engendered due to economic purposes so that one group could maintain power over another group. So again, this is one of those times where we're challenging everything we think we once knew, questioning whether or not the world is round or flat. It's kind of like that. Is race something that's real, or is race something like Santa Claus, something we constructed? However, regardless of all of that, the experience of race is incredibly real, okay? The experience of being black or Asian is very real, despite the fact that there's no genetic basis for race. And as we've talked before, we have more in common genetically between groups than we do within a group because we need genetic diversity. Okay, excellent. Here we go. So again, where does race come from? We've discussed this many times, but the idea is that Europeans wanted to dominate the economic system. They constructed racial categories to be very clear as to who is allowed to belong to what social class and what their social role is. Racial categories have only existed for the last few hundred years. Prior to the 1600s, you will not find any references to race, for example. So maybe it's 300-400 years old at most. It is not something that's been around forever. So again, it's kind of like a program. If you develop a program that's outdated, it's a pretty good idea to upgrade the system and update the program. And so when it comes to race, this is something that was constructed by people only a couple hundred years ago that didn't have access to genetic testings, that really didn't know what race was all about. And now that we've learned a ton of stuff about race, it's very common knowledge now across the medical field and across other fields that there's no such thing as race, that black people don't share common genes, for example. That's not how it works. So basically, the people who came up with race a few hundred years ago were completely wrong about that. They tried to prove it with scientific racism and all these other things, but again, once we discovered genetic testing, that was the end of that. Okay, the argument is pretty much mute now. So the origin of whiteness and blackness is something we're going to talk about, but again, this originates from the dividing, the stratifying of society into racial groups based upon socially constructed categories that do not accurately record people according to biological traits. Okay, the association between economics and slavery, economics and racial categories themselves is, again, Europeans wanted to dominate the social system. So they encoded all people with light-colored skin, European descent, as white, and then everybody else became non-white. And then non-white then became stratified into all kinds of races, like we talked about in the last lecture. There's races that I can't even remember because there's so many ones that are made up. But essentially, it started out with white and non-white, and then in modern times we have black, Native American, Asian. Hispanic is kind of a confused category. Again, all of these are just based upon country of origin or ethnicity. None of them actually code according to biological traits. We're also going to talk about immigration patterns, in the waves of immigration that we had, and then the evolving racial discourse to finalize the lecture. So again, the idea of race is economically, society started to evolve, and we developed this bureaucratized, formalized, capitalist economic system, which is all about the consolidation of capital into the hands of few, based upon a wage labor economy. And so Europeans were, during the age of colonization, going around and trying to dominate the economic system by removing competition and placing themselves on the top tier. And so again, women could not compete historically already. By creating racial categories, you even further removed competition. So the only people that were really able to get access to capital were light-skinned European descendants, okay? So race was created so you have clear-cut lines as to who's allowed to get a job and who can't, who's allowed to go to college and who can't, who's allowed to own property and who is property, okay? So over time, as the racial categories were constructed, we also applied attributes to these, and this is the origin of negative attitudes, prejudice, and then discriminatory actions based upon those negative attitudes in the form of denying access to people from rising up the social class ladder if you were not a light-skinned male. Now, the evolution of the categories themselves, such as white, originally started with just, Spain and European and English people being white. So again, the Irish were considered an inferior race. And then negative attitudes toward Native Americans were engendered during this time. The book talks about some pretty bad slang words that I can never say out loud, but read your book on that section. It talks about, again, the colonizing of Americas by Europeans, and as the Europeans were colonizing not just the Americas but the world, they were putting themselves in the top tier and then placing attributes as European superior, non-European inferior, which evolved over time through the racial discourse. You did at this time have an increase in the slave trade. Again, this is based upon economics. And then you also have the intersection between religion and the state that your book talks about when it talks about how Spain and England are highly influenced by Catholicism on one end and Protestant on the other. And so again, a lot of that ancient history between the English and the Irish, for example, is really just about religion. One is Catholic, one is Protestant, and then the English thought they were superior to the Irish. They thought Protestant was superior, going back all the way to the English Civil War and the beheading of Charles I. So again, whiteness and blackness originates during the slave trade. It was basically, if you had the light-colored skin and you were from Europe, you weren't going to be a slave. And if you were male, you had a chance to compete if you could get some capital. But again, the idea of white privilege is not everyone has privilege, but white males tend to have more access to privilege than others. So again, the idea of race and whiteness and blackness just basically comes out to say who's in what social class. If you were white from Europe, you were allowed to get high elite social positions and compete in the economic market if you had capital. And then everybody else was subjugated into the lower class, including whites that did not have capital. So again, the idea of whiteness and blackness is the construction of social classes themselves. White became bourgeoisie, black became the proletariat, and now you see 300 years of history, okay? Not only were poor whites, competing for capital, hence the workers' rights movements, but now you have women competing for capital, the women's rights movements, civil rights movements to give all the other minorities rights, including people that are disabled, people of racial and ethnic and religious minorities, for example, okay? So the idea of whiteness simply came about to divide society into social classes. Hence the origin is economics. Who's allowed to rise up the social class ladder and who is not, okay? And so Africans became slaves, and how that came about, again, is the idea of the Atlantic slave trade, but Africans were specifically chosen over the Irish, over Native Americans because of a lot of physical reasons and skills, as the book talks about. So here on this slide is where the book was discussing, why Africans were chosen as slaves over the Irish, for example. So when you look at the economics of race, okay, so the upper class, the bourgeoisie, the Europeans, the English and the Spanish, and then along came the French and the German at a later date, and the Dutch. But again, initially the Native Americans were made as indentured servants, but the problem was 90% to 95% of all Native Americans were killed by guns, germs, and disease. Okay? Whites saw themselves as free because they were the ones who wrote the Declaration of Independence, and once they fought the Revolutionary War, they began to see themselves as part of a larger social movement, that they are no longer at the oppression of the upper class, the bourgeoisie, the Europeans. They were now free to economically prosper, but only the whites were allowed to do that. Blacks were chosen as slaves, again, because the Irish didn't have the skills according to the English, and the Native Americans pretty much all died. Okay, and so during this time, you had an incredibly diversification of the economy itself during the age of industrialization, where people migrated from the farms to the cities. Urban development became a thing, and then the owners of the means of production subjugated the working classes, the laborers. And this again caused all kinds of problems. But to create working classes, they brought slaves over. Estimated at least 15 million slaves were brought over. Many more died on the way over. They needed them to do the cotton fields and other agricultural work. And again, it's a little bit of a very dark time, and your book goes very deep into the slave trade. I'm not going to go as deep into it. Definitely read that section in your book, and you get a lot of this from your history classes, which is excellent. But during this time, the experience of being an African in America was incredibly tough. You had your slave codes, you had the destructions of the families, people could be sold at any time, constant raping of the slaves, slave women lived in constant fear. There was a lot of resistance. However, again, you have minority groups overcoming a dominant social and cultural system, an economic system. It was very difficult to pull off. And again, even after Abraham Lincoln, who did everything he could to make things better, he emancipates the slaves. Then after his assassination, there's an epic failure during the Reconstruction, and then the institution of Jim Crow laws to further subjugate people in the lower classes and make sure non-whites couldn't rise up. Okay, so there's an incredible amount of history going on here. 300 years of the development of the Atlantic slave trade. And again, slave trade already existed in Africa and in every other country. I mean, slavery goes back thousands and thousands of years. It's not like the Africans were the only ones engaging in the slave trade. But then when the Europeans went in and started buying tons of slaves, it became big business. It became an economy both for Africa and for the Europeans. So everyone is guilty when it comes to the slave trade. I mean, the history of the world is built on the backs of slave labor. If you read books like King Leopold's Ghost of Belgium going in and reaping the Congo of everything, including the backs of the laborers, whenever you go to Belgium and you see all that beauty, again, that was built on the backs of black slave laborers, people that although you can't say black slave laborers because it's Africa. Because again, in Africa, black is not a thing. Africans, when they come over, don't know they're black until they're followed around a store by a white security guard, and then they find out that they're black according to American standards. Okay, during the age of manifest destiny, this is when the racial diversity definitely starts to increase because it was the migration west that really brought Asians to the United States. It was the migration west that really incorporated lands that were previously Native Americans and Spanish and Mexican. Okay, so during the Manifest Destiny age, taking over the Louisiana Purchase, the Mexican-American War, the United States doubled its country essentially. A big swath of Mexico then became part of the United States. Native Americans were further removed to reservations on not good land. This idea of Eurocentrism really starts to develop where Europeans think they're the center of the world. They think their culture is superior, hence ethnocentrism. Thinking that one's culture is better than another culture. They engage in cultural imperialism where they impose European culture on people that didn't grow up in a capitalist society, weren't used to putting on a collar and going into an office job, for example, or working in a factory. So again, the European way of life becomes instituted as the American way of life. And there's no way to shed the roots of England and Spain and France and Germany from the history of America because that's a huge part of what it became. But the best thing is that over time we've adopted so many other cultures also. All worlds, all places have now been adopted into American culture. But as you guys can see from your own daily lives and from the news and other sources, prejudice and discrimination still exist. There are thousands of hate crimes against African Americans, thousands of hate crimes against Asians every year. Jewish people have more hate crimes than any other religion. It's incredibly sad that these things still exist in a land that we're supposed to, have liberty and justice for all and the ability to pursue happiness without being, blocked by racist institutions, for example. So the first wave of immigration starts off with African slaves and Western Europeans. Okay, then in the 1800s, after the Manifest Destiny, you have large waves of Asians coming over. Then in the 1920s, you start to see large waves of Eastern Europeans. And then after the 1960s, when we open our doors again, you see large waves of Asians and Latin Americans. But throughout this time, we've had a bunch of policies that really went against people based upon how prejudicial people were at the time, for example. So initially, you had the Chinese Exclusion Act of the 1880s, which blocked all Asians from coming to America, and this comes from prejudice against the Chinese, and that meant that everyone got categorized into this, including people from India, people from Japan, people from Mongolia. All were restricted from coming to America because of prejudice. The Eastern Europeans, when people became prejudiced against too many Eastern Europeans, again, we closed our borders, and then we didn't reopen our borders again until the 1960s during the wave of civil rights, when you had this really positive sentiment toward other races growing in America and kind of the reduction of racism in general. But again, over time, our immigration policies have been highly influenced by how prejudicial people are in society at any given time. And so when you guys look at the history of that, that's what you see. So when did everyone become white? And again, originally it was just, English and Spanish were white. And then over time, French and Germans. And then somehow Irish became white. And then Eastern Europeans became white, even though they were originally referred to as dark whites, as that's a quote from your book. But essentially, all light-skinned people gradually got put into this category of white. So, and then where does light skin really come from? You have the northern climate. So where you had more of the northern climates, the people were descending from there, they ended up getting into the category of white. And then white people made very clear that they were separate and not equal to Mexicans, Native Americans, and African Americans, and Asians, for example. And again, this idea is the origination of white privilege because Europeans recognized very early on that because of the color of their skin that they could kind of culturally assimilate with other whites that were, English or Spanish at the time. They were able to bank on their racial privilege to be able to rise up the social class ladder. And so over time, yes, the Irish were highly discriminated against in America, and the policies are really bad against the Irish initially. But once they started to get a majority of people, once they started to get their foot in the door in politics and the police and things along those lines into the institution, they were able to assimilate themselves pretty much because of the color of their skin. So even though the English historically considered them inferior, over time, that white majority began to gain power. Okay? But recognize that, if people that were in poverty this entire time, and instead of thinking of themselves as separate because of the color of their skin or the country of origin, for example, if they saw themselves as one group, the lower class, the majority of the people in the Americas, they at any time could get together and vote out the bourgeoisie and take over society. But racism continuously divides not just the rich and the poor, but the poor from getting together to actually be able to make the world better. So racial segregation came about over hundreds of years of races not wanting to interact with each other. And this is, again, the origin of race-based cultures, because you have to ask, well, where does black culture come from? And where does Jewish culture and Asian culture come from? And why are these all separate? And then why have they maintained their separate identity for hundreds of years in America? And so much of that has to do with racial segregation. And just think to yourself, if you brought home someone from a different race and said, I'm going to marry this person, how would your entire family feel about that? And again, this is how you can kind of see where racism and prejudice still exists. It's just often kind of hidden and covert and not overtly discussed at times, okay? So the modern racial discourse. Racial discourse has changed over time. If we lived back in the day, wow, oh my gosh, racism was just completely acceptable, ever present, and there was racial conflict constantly going on. Usually every 30, 40 years, there was some kind of racial conflict when you go back throughout the news. So again, non-whites and females were historically denied access, and then prejudicial attitudes were then attached to these groups, and again, based on the prejudicial attitudes, discrimination ensued. Okay? So historically, racism was a socially acceptable way of life. That was a cultural norm. To be racist was normal. And that, again, to our times and now, might seem incredibly shocking, but we have to look at history and we have to ask questions. Again, the founding fathers had a chance to enable all people to vote and, have liberty and justice for all, but instead they denied access to anybody that wasn't a European male. So again, it's taken hundreds of years to really undo what could be labeled as the wrongs of our founding fathers and undo, what they did, which again, we did do with the Constitutional Amendment, the 14th Amendment, and we have done with women's rights and the Voting Rights Act and, the Civil Rights Act. And so it's a lot better. But again, racism hasn't gone away. It's a pillar of American society. American society was built on racism and sexism and the domination of social classes by the bourgeoisie in a capitalist society, for example. So to be able to undo the pillars that have held up America for years has been a major struggle. It's taken hundreds of years and many social movements just for a woman to become a surgeon, just for a black man to become president. It's taken a very long time to get to this point. But again, where do the meanings themselves come from? And this is where you can apply symbolic interactionism. And then again, racial meanings are socialized. So people are born into this world, and then they're told you are of this race. Then they're told about other races. Then they're told about attributes attached to those races, for example. And so over time, our negative attitudes and the way we socialize the children and culturally established norms has evolved when it comes to race. It's a lot better. However, you still see prejudice and discrimination. Again, women are still paid 20 cents less. Black females are paid even 20 cents less than the average woman. And again, this is all based upon race. So a male makes $1, a white female makes 80 cents, and a black female makes 60 cents. What's up? Okay, so that's the idea of discrimination. So we have had a lot of modern movements, and again, the reason there are modern movements today is because sexism and racism and other forms of ethnocentrism still exist. Heterosexism still exists. That's why we've had gay rights movements and racial rights movements and ethnic rights movements and women's rights movements, and they're continuing to this day because these have not gone away. Okay, so basically the modern movements, the goals is increasing equity between groups of people, between sexes and races and different religions and different sexualities and different gender identifications, for example. Freedom from violence. Again, minority groups, including women and racial, ethnic, and sexual and gender minorities, experience higher rates of violence. They also experience higher rates of risk factors for substance abuse and psychological and physical disorders and less long of a lifespan. And again, all of this is not because of their genetics. It's because of prejudice and discrimination. I bet you didn't know that prejudice is associated with stress. And then stress causes physical issues like a reduction in the immune system, which then increases the likelihood of heart disease and cancer. And that all comes from racism. And it's kind of weird to think that racism can cause heart disease and cancer, but yes, it does because of what it does to the brain and then how that then affects the body. Okay? So for years, they tried to prove racism. They'd measure people's heads and all kinds of ridiculous stuff. Again, guys, look at the genetic arguments for race. Every medical doctor knows that race just has no accurate basis as a method for coding people according to biological differences. That's just not how it works, okay? Just to finish up, because no one understands critical race theory, apparently, with what I see going on in the news. So critical race theory is just like feminism and all these other great theories. It basically says, look, guys, the world is not fair. These groups receive prejudice and discrimination. It is blocking their access. So all anyone wants is equity and freedom from violence and the ability to live a happy life. So critical race theory is just saying, guys, institutional structures exist which block you. Guys, institutional structures exist that block women. It's the same thing. Women are going to get, a man is going to get promoted 2 times to every one woman because of prejudice and discrimination. So, denying critical race theory is like denying that prejudice and discrimination exists against women. Just look at mortgage rates and how many people of a non-white descent are CEOs of companies, and just look at things along those lines. I mean, how many women are CEOs of companies? That's where you guys see the inequality. All critical race theory says is inequality exists. And then we should try to end in as much inequality as we can. Some inequality is good, don't get me wrong, because you got to motivate people. Like, why pay a doctor more than you pay a restaurant worker? Well, a doctor has to stop, drop, and study for 20 years. It's a huge investment. So some inequality is necessary for motivation, but should someone be able to, have hundreds of millions of dollars and then subjugate everybody else, and then, a lot of other questions. That's critical race theory, though. It's just saying inequality exists in a whole bunch of forms. Specifically, this one's about race, but if we could have a more equitable world, that would be awesome. Please stop being prejudicial and discriminatory against people. Let them rise up on their merit alone. Okay, excellent. So demographically, white is becoming the minority population over time. By, I want to say, 2025, Latin Americans will be a higher number of Latin Americans than whites. Currently, America is about 45% white, 13% black, 30% Hispanic, 8% Asian, about 1% to 2% Native American. But again, these racial categories themselves should be questioned, and we should question whether or not we should continue the use of them and reproduce them from generation to generation, or maybe we should deconstruct them now in modern times. Thank you so much. Have a wonderful day.